For centuries, the fall of the Roman Empire has been explained as an ancient tragedy caused by barbarians at the gates. But what if that story is incomplete? What if Rome didn't fall from invasion, but from within? Economic inequality, currency collapse, political paralysis, urban decay, a shrinking middle class, a loss of civic duty. According to historians, Rome showed warning signs centuries before its final collapse. Now here's the uncomfortable question. Are those same warning signs appearing again, this time in the United States? Rising debt, falling trust, overstretched power. Experts suggest history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. This is not a prediction. This is an investigation. A fact-based comparison between the world's greatest ancient superpower and the modern USA. Before we begin, support deep historical storytelling. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's uncover what history is quietly trying to tell us. Part 1. The Empire that Ruled the World. At its peak, the Roman Empire was a force that shaped continents, cultures, and centuries. With an estimated population of over 60 million people and a military force that dominated much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, Rome appeared invincible. It built roads that stretched across thousands of miles and connected more than 5,000 cities. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, was seen as a triumph of governance, infrastructure, and control. Yet behind the marble columns and triumphal arches, a quiet rot had already begun. The USA, like Rome, emerged as a dominant power in the aftermath of global conflict. After World War II, it became the world's largest economy, leader of the free world, and primary military force. The post-war boom built highways, suburbs, and a strong middle class. Much like Rome's golden era, America experienced a time when optimism and expansion defined its identity. But historians caution that Rome's success story hides the early warnings of its future fall. As Rome stopped expanding its territory, its economy grew more dependent on internal productivity and heavy taxation. Records show that the state increasingly relied on wealth extraction from provinces rather than trade and innovation. In the USA, similar concerns are rising. According to reports by the Congressional Budget Office, economic growth has slowed since the early 2000s, and debt-to-GDP ratios have reached record highs. While new technologies flourish, many workers feel disconnected from that prosperity. The wealth gap has widened sharply, mirroring Rome's growing inequality during its later centuries. By the 3rd century, Roman elites controlled vast land holdings while urban populations struggled to survive under rising taxes and declining services. Political favor, not merit, increasingly decided advancement. Evidence from ancient legal texts suggests that the power of senatorial families became hereditary and less accountable. In the United States, research from top universities indicates that intergenerational wealth has hardened, and access to elite institutions remains highly unequal. Some scholars note that political gridlock and lobbying have made it harder to pass reforms that address these imbalances. Rome also began to suffer from administrative overload. The size of the imperial bureaucracy expanded significantly, with overlapping roles and costly positions. Tax collectors, census officials, and military administrators became a heavy burden on local economies. The USA has also seen the expansion of federal agencies and rising public spending. While public services remain vital, critics argue that inefficiencies and overlapping departments increase long-term costs. According to the Government Accountability Office, improper payments by U.S. agencies totaled over $200 billion in recent years. These systemic strains resemble Rome's overextended bureaucracy. In Rome's case, reforms often came too late or were reversed after changes in leadership. Emperors attempted to stabilize the empire by dividing power between eastern and western halves, but unity never fully returned. In contrast, the United States has so far avoided such fragmentation, but debates over federal versus state authority continue to intensify. During Rome's height, Latin and Roman law unified diverse peoples under a shared identity. Citizenship was eventually extended to almost all free men in the empire. This fostered a sense of belonging but also diluted what it meant to be Roman. In the US, citizenship remains a powerful idea, but social cohesion is increasingly tested. Polls show trust in institutions and media has declined over the last 2 decades. Partisan divisions have widened, and civic dialogue has frayed. According to the Pew Research Center, fewer than 20% of Americans trust the government to do what is right most of the time. Rome also relied heavily on spectacle to maintain public morale. Gladiatorial games, chariot races, and festivals were meant to distract citizens from deeper issues. While not a direct comparison, some cultural critics argue that modern entertainment, social media, and hyper-partisan news serve a similar function, capturing attention while discouraging civic participation. Rome's reliance on spectacle grew as its problems deepened, suggesting a dangerous trade-off between reality and distraction. Another critical factor in Rome's decline was the loss of institutional trust. Emperors rose and fell rapidly during the 3rd century crisis. Some ruled for only months. Assassinations became common. According to historians, this political chaos eroded the legitimacy of the state. In the USA, institutional structures are stronger, and power transfers remain peaceful. However, concerns about election integrity, judicial polarization, and executive overreach are rising. Some scholars warn that if trust continues to fall, even strong institutions can lose credibility. Rome's decline did not come all at once. It unfolded over centuries, with each crisis weakening the foundation a little more. The first visible cracks were economic and administrative. Later came military defeats and territorial losses. The empire did not vanish overnight. It adapted, shrank, and transformed until it was no longer recognizable. The USA still holds unmatched economic and military power, but long-term warning signs persist. This comparison is not about predicting collapse but about understanding resilience. Rome teaches that even the most powerful systems can falter when internal cohesion fades. It also shows that strength at the surface can conceal deep vulnerabilities. Recognizing those signs early is key. In the episodes ahead, we will explore how Rome's monetary policy, military expansion, political instability, urban decline, and foreign pressures led to a dramatic unraveling. At each stage, we will examine whether the same forces are present in America today. Some may argue that the US has safeguards Rome never had: democracy, innovation, and global alliances. Others point to cycles of history and the lessons of complacency. This documentary seeks not to alarm but to investigate. History does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The story of Rome is not just ancient history. It is a mirror, and perhaps a warning. Here is a question for you. Are we paying attention to the right reflections? Part 2. When currency lost its value. In the 3rd century CE, the Roman Empire faced one of its most dangerous and irreversible crises: economic instability triggered by the collapse of its currency. Roman coins, once a symbol of imperial trust and economic health, began to lose their intrinsic value. According to metallurgical studies, the denarius, originally made of 90% silver, dropped below 5% purity in less than 50 years. This practice, known as debasement, was driven by growing military expenses, administrative overload, and a shrinking tax base. Emperors facing fiscal shortfalls chose to mint more coins with less silver instead of raising taxes or cutting spending. The result was rampant inflation and collapsing public confidence. Prices of basic goods soared. Savings became worthless. Wages lost purchasing power. Merchants began rejecting imperial coinage and demanded barter or foreign currency. The crisis was not just economic but psychological. Citizens lost faith in the empire's ability to manage money. In the United States, the dollar remains the dominant global currency, but questions about its long-term strength persist. Since the early 1970s, when the USA moved off the gold standard, the dollar has become a fiat currency, backed not by precious metals but by public trust and government policy. This shift allowed more flexibility in monetary policy but also increased reliance on debt and market expectations. According to reports from the Federal Reserve, the purchasing power of the dollar has declined significantly over the last 50 years. A dollar in 1970 would buy more than 6 times what it does today. Inflation is not new in the USA, but recent years have reignited public concern. Between 2021 and 2023, inflation rates hit levels not seen in 4 decades, driven by global disruptions, supply chain breakdowns, and expansive fiscal policies. The Consumer Price Index climbed rapidly, affecting everything from fuel to food. Many Americans began noticing real declines in their quality of life, even if wages technically increased. The Roman Empire responded to inflation by introducing new coins like the Antoninianus, which carried a higher face value but even less silver content. This created confusion and worsened the problem. Similarly, in the modern era, quantitative easing and aggressive monetary stimulus have raised concerns among economists. While intended to boost economic recovery, these measures can weaken long-term stability if not carefully managed. Experts suggest that persistent deficit spending and rising debt-to-GDP ratios could test the limits of fiscal credibility. In Rome, debasement led to a breakdown of public markets. Long-distance trade declined. Tax collection became erratic. Provinces began to hoard resources and reject central authority. According to historical texts, some governors even minted their own local currencies to maintain order. While the USA has not faced this level of fragmentation, local governments often struggle with funding shortfalls. Cities and states rely heavily on federal support. If inflation persists, public trust in federal management may be strained. The Roman government also tried to control inflation through price controls. Emperor Diocletian's edict on maximum prices set limits on the cost of goods and services. But these measures largely failed. Farmers stopped selling their produce. Black markets flourished. Evidence suggests that rather than stabilizing the economy, the edict deepened scarcity. In the USA, price controls are rare, but government intervention in interest rates, subsidies, and rent caps continues to spark debate. Economists are divided on whether these tools mitigate or prolong economic pain. The core lesson from Rome is not about silver content or ancient coins. It is about confidence. Currency functions because people believe in it. When that belief falters, even mighty empires suffer. In the United States, trust in institutions has declined steadily. According to Gallup surveys, public confidence in financial institutions, the Federal Reserve, and government policy has weakened. The dollar remains strong globally, but at home, many worry about shrinking savings and eroded buying power. Rome also tried to expand its tax base to raise revenue. Small landowners bore the brunt. Wealthier elites often found ways to escape taxation through legal loopholes or imperial favor. This created deep resentment and widened inequality. Modern tax systems in the USA attempt to be progressive, but loopholes, corporate exemptions, and offshore shelters remain contentious issues. Reports from the IRS show that a significant share of tax revenue remains uncollected. Rome's economic collapse did not occur in isolation. It fed into social unrest, military revolt, and administrative failure. As currency lost value, soldiers demanded to be paid in gold or land. Loyalty to the empire weakened. Civil wars became more common. The USA is not at risk of such breakdowns, but the relationship between money, morale, and stability remains relevant. Rising economic anxiety has led to political polarization, labor unrest, and increased protest activity. If confidence in the economic system erodes further, deeper divisions could emerge. Rome's solution was to centralize control even more. Later emperors enforced strict economic laws, froze people in their jobs, and tied peasants to landowners. These emergency measures turned out to be long-term constraints. Innovation slowed. Mobility declined. Prosperity faded. The USA still enjoys immense economic dynamism, but regulatory complexity and rising surveillance in financial systems have raised concerns. Some argue that centralization in response to crisis can harm long-term resilience. Rome's story is a warning against over-reliance on short-term fixes. The empire's economy became reactive, chasing symptoms instead of causes. By the time reforms were proposed, public trust had already collapsed. The USA has tools Rome never had: monetary policy, democratic accountability, and digital innovation. But it also faces global competition, systemic debt, and fragile trust. Understanding how currency stability affects every aspect of governance is crucial. If people stop believing in the value of their wages, their savings, and their future, then no military or institution can hold things together. Currency is not just metal or paper. It is belief. When belief is lost, decline follows. Rome teaches that lesson clearly. So here is a question for you. What does your currency really mean to you today? Part 3. The Burden of Empire. At the height of its power, Rome controlled more than 5 million square kilometers of land, stretching from the misty isles of Britain to the deserts of Arabia. This vast territory required a massive military presence, intricate supply lines, and complex governance to maintain. Historical estimates suggest the Roman army reached over 400,000 active soldiers during the 3rd century. These legions were stationed across distant frontiers, tasked with guarding borders, suppressing revolts, and asserting imperial authority. Supporting this network placed enormous pressure on the central government. Inscriptions and military rosters reveal that soldiers often waited months to receive pay, and veterans demanded land grants that drained state resources. The more Rome expanded, the more it struggled to sustain the weight of its own empire. In the modern era, the United States maintains the largest overseas military infrastructure in the world. With over 700 foreign bases in more than 70 countries and an annual defense budget exceeding $800 billion, the USA faces similar questions about long-term sustainability. According to Department of Defense data, maintaining these global operations consumes more than half of discretionary federal spending. While these outposts serve strategic purposes, they also carry economic and diplomatic costs. Like Rome, the USA must balance domestic needs with global commitments. In the Roman Empire, distant campaigns became increasingly costly and less profitable. Conquering new lands brought initial wealth, but holding them drained the treasury. Revolts in Judea, rebellions in Gaul, and wars with Persia required constant military deployment. The empire's attention was divided, and its forces stretched thin. According to historians, Rome eventually shifted from offense to defense, building massive border walls and fortifications like Hadrian's Wall to hold what it already had. The United States, though not an empire in the classical sense, faces similar strategic shifts. Military interventions in the Middle East, peacekeeping in Eastern Europe, and naval operations in the Pacific demonstrate a continued effort to project power. However, analysts warn that sustaining multiple long-term operations can exhaust manpower, resources, and public will. After 2 decades of engagement in Afghanistan and Iraq, the USA has begun rethinking its global posture. In both Rome and America, the cost of empire is not just financial. It is also political. Rome's citizens began to question why so much of their wealth supported distant lands while their own cities declined. Ancient letters and writings reveal growing resentment among taxpayers and small landowners. In the USA, polls show a similar skepticism. A 2022 survey by the Eurasia Group Foundation found that a growing number of Americans favor reduced military involvement abroad. Many argue that those funds should be redirected toward healthcare, education, and infrastructure. As Rome's empire grew older, it relied more on allied and mercenary forces rather than Roman-born soldiers. These federati were granted land and privileges in exchange for military service. While this system filled gaps, it also introduced instability. Loyalty became transactional. Some of these groups later turned against Rome, contributing to its downfall. In the United States, the military remains an all-volunteer force, but recruitment challenges have surfaced. Reports from the Pentagon show difficulties in meeting enlistment targets. A shrinking pool of eligible candidates, health concerns, and shifting attitudes toward military service are all factors. If sustaining troop levels becomes harder, the USA may also face tough choices about its global commitments. The Roman Empire attempted to integrate its provinces through roads, trade, and Roman law, but cultural and ethnic divisions persisted. In times of crisis, these fractures widened. Evidence from archaeological sites suggests that provincial cities began prioritizing local defense over imperial unity. In the USA, federal and state responsibilities are clearly defined, but political polarization has strained this balance. States increasingly chart their own paths on major issues, from education to economic policy. This decentralization, while constitutional, echoes Rome's later years when governors acted more autonomously. In both cases, central authority becomes harder to enforce across a diverse and expansive domain. Rome also saw a shift in its political narrative. Emperors no longer spoke only of conquest but of survival. Inscriptions stopped celebrating victories and began praising peace, order, and divine protection. The language of strength gave way to the language of preservation. Similarly, American foreign policy has shifted tone over the past 2 decades. After the triumphalism of the 1990s, the narrative now emphasizes stability, deterrence, and containment. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy focuses more on maintaining rules-based order than on projecting overwhelming force. Like Rome, the USA is adapting to a world where it must hold its ground rather than expand its reach. Another cost of empire is the psychological burden. Roman citizens once felt pride in their expanding frontiers. But by the late empire, they feared invasions, corruption, and economic decline. Public morale fell. According to ancient chroniclers, even Rome's elite began fleeing the city during times of crisis. In the United States, public sentiment toward government and institutions has declined. Surveys from Pew Research Center show trust in federal leadership and media is at record lows. Foreign policy fatigue, domestic polarization, and rising economic anxiety all contribute to a sense of unease. The perception that the USA is overextended has become part of mainstream debate. Rome also failed to innovate administratively as its empire grew. It clung to outdated models of governance, resisted reforms, and failed to decentralize effectively. According to historians, the bureaucracy became rigid and unresponsive. In the USA, government modernization has been slow. Reports from the Government Accountability Office highlight issues with outdated IT systems, slow response to crises, and growing bureaucratic inefficiency. While the USA remains far more flexible than ancient Rome, these structural weaknesses echo similar patterns. Rome tried to solve its imperial problems through reforms. Diocletian divided the empire. Constantine moved the capital. But each solution introduced new tensions. In the USA, debates continue about how to adapt. Should the military footprint shrink? Should more be invested in domestic renewal? These are modern versions of ancient questions. Empire brings power, but it also brings responsibility, risk, and resistance. The Roman Empire could not carry its burden forever. The United States still can, but only if it learns from the weight others once carried. Here is a question for you. How long can a nation lead the world before it forgets to care for its own foundations? Part 4. Political instability from within. In the late stages of the Roman Empire, political stability became a fleeting illusion as emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. Between 235 and 284 CE, known as the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome saw over 20 emperors take the throne in just 50 years. Many of them were assassinated, overthrown by generals, or defeated by rivals before establishing lasting policies. According to ancient historians, political office no longer followed order or lineage but was often decided on the battlefield. The Praetorian Guard, once protectors of the emperor, became kingmakers and power brokers. This period eroded faith in Rome's institutions and weakened the state's legitimacy. In the modern United States, leadership transitions remain peaceful, and elections continue as scheduled. However, growing polarization and declining institutional trust present their own dangers. According to Gallup polling data, confidence in Congress, the Supreme Court, and even the presidency has reached historic lows. The events of recent years, including disputes over election outcomes, mass protests, and challenges to judicial authority, reflect a broader erosion of shared political norms. Experts suggest that when citizens begin to question the legitimacy of their leaders or the fairness of the system, long-term cohesion is at risk. Rome's political chaos also fueled regional instability. Provinces stopped waiting for imperial direction and began appointing their own military commanders as de facto governors. These strongmen often ignored the capital's orders, redirected taxes, or declared loyalty only when convenient. In the USA, federalism protects state rights, but increasingly, states diverge widely in their policies on healthcare, education, and law enforcement. While this decentralization is built into the American system, it can resemble the weakening of central authority if national consensus breaks down. Rome also suffered from internal factions. Senators, generals, religious leaders, and business elites all competed for influence, often sabotaging each other's reforms. Historical records show that emperors were forced to appease these groups to survive, leading to inconsistent policies and delayed action during crises. In the USA, lobbying, partisan gridlock, and special interest influence have made it difficult to pass major legislation. Policy swings between administrations have created uncertainty for both domestic and foreign actors. Scholars note that governing through executive orders rather than congressional consensus is a sign of political strain. Another feature of Rome's decline was the militarization of politics. Generals who commanded loyalty from troops often challenged the authority of the emperor. Civil wars broke out between rival armies, and loyalty to the empire was replaced by loyalty to individuals. While the United States military remains under civilian control and no such risk exists today, analysts note that the use of military imagery in politics and increased veteran participation in partisan debates could become problematic if norms are not upheld. Rome's political class also grew distant from its population. Senators once held local town halls and governed through public engagement, but by the 4th century, many had retreated into private estates. Bureaucrats and imperial appointees replaced elected civic leaders. The result was a disconnect between rulers and the ruled. In the USA, voter turnout in many elections remains low, and many citizens feel alienated from national leadership. Campaign financing, gerrymandering, and media echo chambers have deepened this divide. Some experts argue that political alienation today reflects an ancient pattern of elite detachment. In Rome, political instability discouraged investment and innovation. Wealthy families hid their assets or moved them offshore to avoid confiscation. Public works projects stalled. Educational institutions declined. Confidence in the future faded. In modern America, political dysfunction has delayed infrastructure bills, science funding, and long-term economic planning. According to the Congressional Budget Office, uncertainty over fiscal policy has directly impacted markets and investor behavior. Rome also lost the art of succession. Without a stable method of transferring power, each emperor's death triggered a power struggle. Some were chosen by the army, others by conspiracy, and few by formal declaration. Although the United States maintains a clear constitutional process for presidential succession, recent disputes have shown that even formal systems can be strained under pressure. Disinformation, legal challenges, and contested narratives can destabilize transitions if not resolved swiftly. Another challenge Rome faced was the shrinking talent pool for leadership. As the political environment grew dangerous, fewer qualified individuals sought high office. The role of senator or governor became less about service and more about survival. According to contemporary sources, corruption and mediocrity became common among the elite. In the United States, the high cost and intense scrutiny of political campaigns have discouraged many capable candidates from running. Public trust in elected officials has declined, and politics is often viewed as performance rather than governance. Rome's final emperors tried to restore order through reforms, but the foundations were too fractured. Diocletian restructured the empire into east and west to reduce infighting, but this division led to competing interests and eventual collapse. The USA remains united, but political division is now deeply regional. Voting patterns, legal frameworks, and even cultural norms vary widely between states. While federalism allows flexibility, unchecked divergence can resemble fragmentation. In Rome, civic identity was eventually replaced by survival. Citizens stopped identifying with the state and began relying on local networks. Trust in the empire gave way to trust in local rulers, militias, and religious institutions. In America, faith in national unity still holds, but signs of tribalism, political, economic, and ideological, are increasing. According to the Brookings Institution, the USA is entering an era where facts, norms, and even laws are interpreted through partisan lenses. Rome's collapse was not inevitable, but its failure to manage internal discord was fatal. The modern United States operates under a very different system, but the warning signs are visible. Political stability is not just about elections, it's about trust, participation, and the ability to adapt. If these pillars weaken, the structure above them becomes vulnerable. Rome lost that balance and never recovered. The USA still has time to reinforce it. Here is a question for you. What does it take to keep a republic stable when the storm is already inside the gates? Part 5. The collapse of urban centers. At the core of the Roman Empire's power were its great cities, Rome, Antioch, Carthage, Alexandria, centers of commerce, governance, and innovation. These cities thrived on a network of trade, efficient administration, and imperial investment. But as the empire weakened, these urban centers began to decay. Archaeological records show that many Roman cities lost population rapidly from the 3rd century onward. Public baths, aqueducts, and forums fell into disrepair. Streets once bustling with markets became overgrown. As tax revenue declined and protection faltered, elites fled to rural villas, abandoning urban responsibilities. The USA does not face a mass collapse of its cities, but evidence indicates urban stress is mounting. According to census data, major cities like San Francisco, Chicago, and New York have seen significant population decline since 2020, driven by housing costs, safety concerns, and economic shifts. Rome's cities became vulnerable when trade routes shrank and labor shortages struck. Similarly, some American cities now suffer from labor mismatches, housing inequality, and infrastructure breakdowns. Rome's urban decline was accelerated by neglect. Municipal budgets dried up. Civic institutions crumbled. Ancient city councils that once managed services ceased to function. In modern America, local governments are under strain. Reports from the National League of Cities highlight chronic underfunding for transit, water systems, and public safety. Deferred maintenance and aging infrastructure pose systemic risks. In Rome, one of the most telling signs of collapse was the breakdown of public sanitation. Aqueducts that brought clean water stopped functioning due to lack of upkeep or sabotage. Disease spread rapidly. Public health deteriorated. In the USA, aging water systems have become a national concern. The Flint water crisis revealed how neglected systems can poison communities. The American Society of Civil Engineers consistently gives the nation's infrastructure a low grade, citing billions in needed investment. Rome's cities also faced external threats. As imperial control waned, they became targets for raids. Cities without walls were especially vulnerable. Rome itself was sacked multiple times in the 5th century, something once considered unthinkable. While American cities are not under siege, their vulnerability lies in cybersecurity, energy grids, and social unrest. A single cyber attack can paralyze hospitals, pipelines, or transport systems. The decline of Roman cities led to a loss of collective civic identity. Public spaces were no longer safe. Theaters closed. Forums emptied. People retreated into private lives. In the USA, polarization and urban isolation have weakened public life. Analysts report that civic participation in town halls, school boards, and community events is declining. Rome once invested in large-scale construction to restore public confidence. Emperor Augustus famously claimed he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. But later emperors lacked the resources or vision for such renewal. The USA has passed major infrastructure legislation in recent years, but implementation has been slow. Red tape, legal battles, and workforce shortages have delayed progress. Rome's failure to maintain cities also affected education and innovation. Public libraries, philosophical schools, and scientific centers disappeared. Urban decay meant intellectual stagnation. In modern America, budget cuts to public schools and higher education, especially in urban areas, have raised alarms. The Brookings Institution warns that underfunded education systems could weaken future innovation and competitiveness. In the later Roman Empire, property values in cities fell dramatically. Merchants closed their shops. Landlords abandoned rental buildings. Economic data from ancient sources suggest a sharp decline in urban economic activity. In the USA, retail closures, office vacancies, and rising homelessness are transforming downtown districts. Some cities report commercial occupancy rates below 50%. Rome's shrinking cities lost the ability to support armies, pay taxes, or contribute to the larger system. The empire became a patchwork of weak urban centers surrounded by self-sufficient rural estates. In the USA, the urban-rural divide is growing. Economically, politically, and socially, these regions operate under very different conditions. This division affects policy, elections, and national identity. In Rome, once vibrant metropolises became ghost towns. Temples were looted. Marble was stripped for reuse. The physical collapse mirrored a psychological one. Citizens no longer saw their cities as safe, thriving places. They became places to escape, not build. In the United States, suburban flight, especially after the pandemic, echoes that pattern. High costs, crime concerns, and remote work have pushed many to leave core urban zones. Rome attempted reforms, such as tax breaks and resettlement programs, to revive cities, but these measures failed without underlying stability. Some modern American cities are experimenting with guaranteed income, tax incentives, and revitalization projects. However, experts warn that unless public safety, education, and transportation are addressed together, these efforts may falter. The decline of Roman cities created a feedback loop. As cities collapsed, so did tax revenue, which further limited the state's ability to respond. In the USA, budget deficits in large cities like Los Angeles and Chicago reflect similar risks. Federal bailouts may be temporary solutions, not permanent fixes. Rome's urban decline also created a leadership vacuum. With elites withdrawing, criminal elements filled the void. Bandits, warlords, and local strongmen took control. Law enforcement collapsed. In the USA, law enforcement staffing shortages and rising crime in certain cities have become pressing issues. Confidence in public safety is a cornerstone of urban life. Without it, urban renewal becomes nearly impossible. Rome's decay happened over generations. Each emperor inherited deeper problems. Short-term fixes delayed collapse but did not reverse it. In America, leaders face a similar challenge, balancing immediate needs with long-term urban renewal. The stakes are high. Cities are engines of innovation, diversity, and economic power. Their collapse weakens an entire nation. The lesson from Rome is simple but sobering. When cities fall, civilizations follow. Urban decay is not just a local issue, it's a national one. Here is a question for you. Are we investing in the survival of our cities, or just waiting for someone else to fix them? Part 6. The Shrinking Middle Class. One of the lesser-known but deeply consequential shifts in the Roman Empire was the slow erosion of its economic backbone. The independent farmer, the skilled artisan, the middle-tier merchant. In the early centuries of the Republic and even into the Empire, these individuals formed a stabilizing force. They paid taxes, served in the military, and participated in local governance. But by the 3rd century, historical records show that this class was shrinking rapidly. Large estates owned by the elite absorbed smaller farms. Debts forced many to give up their land and labor for wealthier patrons. Once independent citizens became tenant farmers, or coloni, bound to land they no longer owned. The state's reliance on this shrinking base triggered long-term damage to civic life and tax revenue. In the USA, the middle class was long considered its greatest strength, a sign of upward mobility and shared prosperity. But reports from the Pew Research Center show that since the 1970s, the percentage of Americans considered middle income has declined steadily. Wage growth for average households has stagnated when adjusted for inflation. Meanwhile, housing, education, and healthcare costs have risen sharply. Just as in Rome, those at the top have accumulated greater shares of wealth, while many others struggle to keep pace. In Rome, This economic shift wasn't just a story of numbers. It changed the structure of society. People who lost their land also lost their vote, their role in the army, and their status. They became dependent on the elite for protection and survival. In the USA, economic precarity has made homeownership and retirement increasingly difficult for many. Studies show that millennials and Gen Z adults are far less likely to own property or accumulate savings compared to previous generations. Rome tried to solve this imbalance through state intervention. Emperors imposed grain doles, subsidies, and work programs. But these were often poorly managed or manipulated by local officials. Corruption grew. According to ancient sources, the grain supply to Rome was sometimes disrupted by hoarding or fraud. In the United States, modern safety nets like unemployment benefits and social programs exist. But critics argue that loopholes, bureaucracy, and uneven access reduce their effectiveness. The challenge isn't just providing aid, it's ensuring that it rebuilds independence rather than dependency. Rome's economic elite gained increasing control over politics. Landowners influenced tax laws, military appointments, and infrastructure spending. The divide between public need and private interest widened. In the USA, political donations and lobbying by corporations and wealthy individuals shape policy in significant ways. Reports from watchdog organizations show that tax breaks and subsidies often favor the top income brackets. Economic power, once concentrated, can reshape democratic priorities. In Rome, the decline of the middle class also led to declining civic participation. Fewer people served in public office or joined the army. Local governments weakened. Cultural life, education, and innovation suffered. In the USA, declining economic security has been linked to political disengagement. Voter turnout often correlates with income level. When people feel economically excluded, they are more likely to withdraw from civic duties. Rome attempted legal reforms to slow the concentration of wealth. Emperor Tiberius Gracchus, centuries earlier, had proposed land redistribution. But later emperors hesitated to challenge the aristocracy. Laws were passed but not enforced. In the USA, debates about minimum wage, taxation, and labor rights continue, but meaningful reform faces political obstacles. Economists argue that rebuilding the middle class requires not just wealth redistribution but investment in education, training, and infrastructure. In Rome's final centuries, the colony system became entrenched. People born into tenant farming roles could not leave. Labor was inherited. This set the stage for feudalism in the post-Roman world. In the USA, while social mobility remains possible, research from Harvard and Stanford indicates that zip code and parental income still heavily influence future success. Upward mobility has slowed in many parts of the country. The consequences are long-term. In Rome, the erosion of the middle class left the empire dependent on fragile systems of loyalty. People worked for survival, not for community or progress. Innovation slowed. Trade shrank. In modern America, economic stress has also reshaped goals. According to Gallup surveys, more young Americans are prioritizing financial survival over long-term dreams like owning a home or starting a business. Rome's experience shows that a thriving middle class isn't just a feature of prosperity, it's the foundation of it. Without that core, societies become top-heavy and brittle. When crises come, there are fewer citizens invested in holding the system together. The USA still has a larger and more diverse economy than ancient Rome ever did. It has tools for economic renewal that Rome could not imagine. But the warning stands. A society that loses its middle becomes unstable. Rebuilding economic balance isn't about ideology. It's about survival. Rome forgot that lesson until it was too late. The United States cannot afford the same mistake. Here is a question for you. If the middle disappears, who is left to carry the weight of a nation? Part 7. The Rise of Outsiders. As the Roman Empire aged, it became increasingly dependent on people who were once considered outsiders: foreign soldiers, migrant laborers, and borderland allies. Rome had always been a diverse empire, incorporating many cultures into its system. But in its later centuries, this reliance took on a different character. With native-born Romans less willing or able to serve in the military, emperors recruited heavily from non-Roman tribes and frontier regions. According to records from the Notitia Dignitatum, a 4th-century Roman military registry, a growing share of the army was composed of Gothic, Frankish, and Germanic recruits. Some rose through the ranks and were granted Roman citizenship. Others remained loyal only to their own leaders. The loyalty of these new recruits was uncertain, and their integration into Roman society was incomplete. In the modern United States, immigration has long been a source of national strength. Millions have come seeking opportunity and freedom, contributing to labor, culture, and innovation. But in recent years, public discourse around immigration has grown more divided. According to Pew Research Center, debates over border security, refugee policy, and legal pathways have intensified. While most immigrants integrate successfully, the political friction surrounding their arrival reflects deeper concerns about identity and cohesion. In Rome, the blurred lines between friend and foe created tension. Emperors offered land and military roles to entire tribes, hoping to turn enemies into allies. The most famous example came in 376 CE, when the Gothic tribes were allowed to settle in Roman territory to escape the Huns. But according to chroniclers like Ammianus Marcellinus, the Gothic settlement was mismanaged. Food shortages and mistreatment led to revolt. Within 2 years, the Battle of Adrianople saw the Roman army crushed by the very group they had tried to welcome. In the USA, fears of social instability tied to immigration often exaggerate risks. Data shows immigrants commit fewer crimes and contribute significantly to the economy. Still, the Roman example illustrates how poor policy, inadequate planning, and political manipulation of migration can fuel unrest. Rome's political class also grew suspicious of newcomers. Laws were passed to restrict land ownership and access to office for non-Romans. These actions deepened divisions and delayed integration. In the United States, legal immigrants still face barriers to voting, home loans, and long-term status. Analysts suggest that exclusionary policies weaken trust and fuel underground economies. Rome also failed to manage population flows at the border. The frontier zones along the Rhine and Danube became porous as imperial control weakened. Entire communities crossed into Roman territory without formal permission. Local governors, unable to enforce policy, either tolerated these settlements or made private deals. In the modern world, border management is a challenge for many nations, but the United States, with its extensive southern border, faces constant political pressure to balance security, law, and humanitarian obligations. Like Rome, state-level responses sometimes contradict federal policy. Rome's reliance on foreign generals eventually undermined its core institutions. Men like Stilicho and Ricimer were of non-Roman origin but commanded Roman armies. Though they defended the empire for years, their power exposed Rome's dependence on figures who operated outside traditional norms. In the USA, the military and political institutions remain robust, but experts warn about the rising influence of unregulated actors, private military contractors, corporate lobbying groups, and foreign-owned media platforms. When central power fragments, non-traditional actors fill the gap. Another consequence of Rome's dependency was cultural confusion. As foreign customs blended into Roman cities, older citizens saw it as decline. Statues, clothing, and even language began to shift. Latin remained official, but local dialects flourished. Public ceremonies lost their traditional character. In the USA, cultural change has always been part of its identity, but the speed of change today, driven by global media, immigration, and economic shifts, has created generational divides. Debates over language, curriculum, and national symbols reflect this tension. Rome's elites often blamed outsiders for problems created by internal decay. Instead of addressing inequality, corruption, or weak leadership, scapegoating became common. In the USA, political discourse sometimes targets immigrants during periods of economic stress, even when data shows deeper systemic causes. Rome's decline was not caused by immigration, but by its inability to manage and integrate new populations effectively. Emperors who embraced diversity with structure and support prolonged stability. Those who neglected it, or stoked fear for short-term gain, hastened collapse. The United States remains a beacon for people around the world, but the challenge is not simply how many come, it is how well society supports their transition into full participants. Citizenship, service, and civic identity must be renewed, not taken for granted. Rome teaches that great nations do not fall because they welcome the world. They fall when they forget how to unite it. The rise of outsiders was not Rome's undoing. It was their failure to bring them inside the circle of shared purpose. Here is a question for you. Are we building walls to protect our strength, or hiding behind them as it fades? Part 8. Infrastructure that couldn't last. The Roman Empire is still admired today for its remarkable infrastructure. Roads that connected cities across continents, aqueducts that carried water to millions, and public buildings that defined the skyline of every province. These achievements weren't just symbols of Rome's might, they were its foundation. Trade, military deployment, taxation, and communication all depended on a functioning physical network. Yet by the 4th century, cracks began to appear, both literally and metaphorically. Ancient sources describe roads in disrepair, collapsing bridges, and aqueducts left unrepaired due to funding shortages or local conflict. Maintenance had fallen victim to political chaos and declining revenue. In the USA, infrastructure built during the 20th century remains vast but is aging rapidly. The American Society of Civil Engineers consistently grades national infrastructure poorly, pointing to thousands of structurally deficient bridges, outdated water systems, and strained power grids. Rome teaches that infrastructure, once neglected, becomes not only a burden but a liability. In the Roman model, early investment was often directed and funded by local elites. Wealthy citizens were expected to finance roads, temples, and public amenities as a form of civic duty. But as economic power concentrated and the middle class shrank, fewer elites felt obligated to invest in the public good. In the USA, similar trends are visible. Public-private partnerships exist, but overall public investment as a share of GDP has declined over recent decades. Experts warn that if maintenance continues to be delayed, replacement costs will multiply. In late Rome, the decline in infrastructure directly impacted the economy. With roads crumbling, trade routes were disrupted. Farmers could not get goods to market. Military units could not be moved quickly in times of crisis. According to archaeological findings, many towns that once thrived on trade became isolated and economically stagnant. In America, supply chains depend on functioning ports, rail lines, highways, and digital infrastructure. When any of these fail, as seen during extreme weather events or cyber attacks, entire sectors suffer. The interconnectedness of modern systems means that neglect in one area quickly spreads to others. Rome also suffered from uneven investment. The capital and a few favored cities received constant attention, while outer provinces saw minimal repair. This regional imbalance bred resentment and disloyalty. In the USA, similar disparities exist. Wealthier urban regions often receive upgrades while rural areas and older industrial towns face declining infrastructure. According to the Brookings Institution, this uneven distribution contributes to political division and economic frustration. In its final centuries, Rome attempted quick fixes. Patchwork repairs, rushed construction, and reused materials became common. Some emperors ordered grand projects for prestige, but local engineers lacked the skill or tools to complete them. In the USA, infrastructure bills have been passed with historic funding levels, but actual implementation has been slow. Projects are delayed by regulatory hurdles, labor shortages, and rising material costs. Reports from the Department of Transportation note that shovel-ready projects often face multi-year timelines. In Rome, water infrastructure suffered first. Aqueducts clogged or collapsed. Public fountains dried up. Without clean water, disease spread. Sanitation declined. The physical health of cities deteriorated. In the USA, clean water is not guaranteed. The Flint crisis, widespread lead pipe usage, and contamination from industrial runoff threaten public health. The Environmental Protection Agency estimates that over $470 billion is needed to upgrade water systems over the next 2 decades. Rome's forums, once symbols of civic life, became unusable. Grass grew through paving stones. Statues toppled. Public buildings were looted for construction materials. Urban centers began to shrink physically. In modern cities across the USA, abandoned buildings, decaying roads, and underused transit systems signal economic and social decline. This visual decay erodes community pride and investor confidence. Rome's military infrastructure also declined. Forts went unmanned. Signal towers stopped functioning. Without these systems, frontier defense collapsed. In America, military bases remain well-funded, but other forms of strategic infrastructure, such as cybersecurity, energy grids, and communications networks, face growing threats. A single outage or breach can ripple across sectors. Rome's postal system, once the envy of the ancient world, failed as roads deteriorated. Messages were delayed or never delivered. Provincial governors acted without imperial instructions. In the USA, while physical mail is less vital today, digital infrastructure is the new lifeline. But broadband deserts still exist, especially in rural areas, and internet outages disrupt education, commerce, and public safety. Another lesson from Rome is how infrastructure affects legitimacy. When citizens see bridges collapse, potholes multiply, and transit fail, they begin to doubt the competence of leadership. This erosion of trust is difficult to rebuild. In modern America, public frustration grows when billions are allocated, but projects remain unfinished. Rome's story warns that infrastructure is more than concrete, it's confidence. In its later years, Rome cannibalized its own structures. Stones from old temples were used to repair walls. Bronze statues were melted down for coins. Great monuments became quarries. In the USA, infrastructure is rarely destroyed for parts, but underfunding repairs often means letting systems decay until they are unusable. Deferred maintenance is functionally the same as demolition over time. Rome's failure was not in building great things. It was in forgetting how to preserve them. The USA still has time. Engineers, planners, and workers across the nation know what must be done. What's needed is sustained political will, equitable investment, and long-term vision. Infrastructure is not a short-term prize. It's a promise to the next generation. Here is a question for you. What happens when the things that once connected us are allowed to fall apart? Part 9. The Fall of Civic Duty. One of the defining traits of early Roman society was the idea of civic responsibility. From the days of the Republic through the early Empire, Roman citizens, especially those in the middle class, participated in public life, voted in assemblies, served in local councils, financed infrastructure, and joined the legions. There was pride in serving Rome. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, this culture had eroded. Records from imperial edicts and personal letters show that fewer people wanted to hold public office. The role of a city official or tax collector became a burden, not an honor. Civic roles often came with heavy financial obligations and risk. Instead of volunteering, people fled from appointments. Some bribed officials to be exempt. Others simply abandoned cities and moved to rural estates, placing loyalty to their local landowners over the empire. In the USA, civic participation remains strong in many areas, but national trends show a worrying decline. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, voter turnout has been erratic in recent decades, with local and midterm elections drawing particularly low engagement. Trust in democratic processes has also fallen. Pew Research reports that fewer than 20% of Americans say they trust the government to do what's right most of the time. Civic life, once seen as a shared responsibility, is increasingly viewed through partisan or transactional lenses. In Rome, this withdrawal from public life had real consequences. Cities lost their leaders. Schools closed. Courts functioned poorly. Without engaged citizens, the empire's decentralized governance structure began to collapse from the ground up. In the USA, school board meetings, town halls, and community planning boards are essential layers of democratic life. But participation in these spaces has dropped or become highly polarized, reducing their effectiveness. Rome also relied on voluntary military service during much of its early empire. But as incentives disappeared and threats multiplied, fewer Roman citizens joined the army. By the 4th century, most soldiers were recruited from frontier tribes or conscripted from rural populations. Loyalty shifted from state to salary. In the United States, the all-volunteer military remains professional and well-respected, but recruitment has grown more difficult. Pentagon reports show missed enlistment targets and growing gaps in readiness. Civic duty is not just about service, it's about belief in a shared project. Rome lost that belief. The USA still has it, but it is increasingly challenged. Rome also witnessed the decay of its civic rituals. Festivals, games, public debates, and commemorations once created a shared identity. But as funds disappeared and social cohesion broke down, many of these traditions faded. Temples were neglected, forums emptied, and theater audiences dwindled. The glue that held people together weakened. In modern America, civic rituals include national holidays, public memorials, volunteer events, and local traditions. But surveys show declining attendance, lower volunteerism, and a weakening sense of community in many areas. Social media, though a tool for connection, has often replaced in-person civic interaction with online polarization. In Rome's late period, elites became more detached from civic life. They isolated themselves in lavish estates, used wealth to bypass responsibilities, and increasingly treated governance as a means of personal protection. Ancient sources describe how wealthy senators would avoid taxes, refuse public service, and relocate to avoid urban decay. In the USA, some critics argue that modern elites, through tax shelters, political donations, or gated communities, have also become more removed from everyday civic responsibilities. The loss of a shared experience between social classes damages national unity. Rome attempted to legislate civic duty. Emperors passed laws forcing citizens to take public roles, serve in the military, and pay taxes. But forced participation only created resentment. Many went into hiding. Others bribed officials. A society that must compel service has already lost much of its moral authority. In the USA, civic engagement must be cultivated, not coerced. Efforts to promote voting, volunteering, and local leadership depend on restoring trust and making participation meaningful. Rome's decline in civic duty also weakened its response to crisis. When famine, invasion, or plague struck, people acted for themselves, not the community. Grain hoarding, price gouging, and flight from cities were common. Without civic trust, collective action failed. In the United States, responses to national emergencies like pandemics or natural disasters show how vital trust and civic behavior are. Where communities cooperated, outcomes improved. Where suspicion and division prevailed, responses faltered. Rome also saw a rise in fatalism during its decline. Writers and poets of the time describe a sense of helplessness, a belief that nothing could change. This psychological withdrawal may have been more damaging than any military defeat. In the USA, civic cynicism has grown. Young Americans especially express doubt that participation leads to change. Surveys from Harvard's Institute of Politics show that while interest in issues remains high, faith in institutions is low. Rome never fully recovered its sense of civic purpose. By the time of the Western Empire's fall in 476 CE, public life had largely been replaced by private survival. The empire had citizens in name, but not in spirit. The United States, despite its challenges, retains strong civic traditions. But maintaining them requires effort, leadership, and shared belief. Civic duty is not an ancient relic, it's a living framework. Without it, roads crumble, laws are ignored, and communities unravel. Rome lost its foundation when it lost its citizens' sense of responsibility. The USA still has time to strengthen its own. Here is a question for you. Are we building a future of citizens or spectators? Part 10. Climate, Crisis, and Collapse. One of the less visible yet profoundly influential forces behind the Roman Empire's decline was environmental change. For centuries, Rome thrived during what historians call the Roman climate optimum, a period of relatively stable, warm, and wet conditions that favored agriculture, trade, and population growth. Grain from Egypt, olives from Spain, and wine from Gaul all flowed freely through Roman ports. But beginning in the 3rd century, climate data from tree rings, lake sediments, and ice cores shows a significant shift. Droughts increased. Floods damaged cities. Crops failed across the empire. This environmental instability struck at the heart of Rome's ability to feed its population and pay its armies. In the modern United States, climate change is not speculative, it's measurable and visible. According to NOAA and NASA, the past decade was the hottest on record. Wildfires, hurricanes, floods, and droughts are growing in both frequency and severity. Just as Rome's stability relied on predictable harvests and temperate seasons, the USA's infrastructure, agriculture, and economy are vulnerable to growing environmental volatility. In Rome's case, the loss of agricultural productivity triggered cascading effects. North Africa, once the empire's breadbasket, suffered declining yields due to desertification. The Tiber River flooded more frequently, damaging crops and city infrastructure. Inscriptions and tax records show desperate attempts to adjust land policies and offer grain subsidies, but nothing reversed the trend. In the USA, the Southwest faces megadrought conditions, with the Colorado River, lifeblood for millions, approaching crisis levels. The Midwest has seen increased crop losses from both floods and heat waves. The insurance industry reports billions in damages annually, a sign that climate stress is already impacting economic calculations. Rome's food shortages led to price spikes and riots. The government tried to fix prices and secure grain by force. Emperor Diocletian's edict on maximum prices aimed to control inflation, but it backfired. Merchants hoarded supplies or fled markets entirely. In modern America, supply chain disruptions, exacerbated by climate events, have already driven inflation in food and energy. The modern economy is more complex and globalized, but its weak points echo Rome's. When the system depends on just-in-time logistics, climate shocks ripple fast. Rome also suffered from plagues worsened by environmental stress. The Antonine Plague and later the Plague of Cyprian devastated population centers. Some researchers suggest that shifting climate may have expanded disease vectors or weakened immune resistance through famine. In the USA, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed how a single biological event can upend national stability, disrupt trade, overwhelm healthcare, and shake public trust. Climate change is expected to increase the risk of future pandemics by expanding the habitats of pathogens and reducing public health resilience. Another climate-driven issue in Rome was migration. As the environment changed, nomadic groups and entire populations moved in search of food and safety. The Goths and Vandals were not just invaders, they were climate migrants. Rome struggled to absorb these groups, especially as its own resources dwindled. Today, the USA faces growing pressure from climate-related migration. Disasters in Central America, rising sea levels in island nations, and conflict-driven famine in Africa are already pushing people northward. The Department of Defense has identified climate migration as a security risk. Rome's leaders often responded too late or with force instead of foresight. In both cases, the pressure is not simply about borders. It's about how environmental collapse tests national identity and capacity. Rome also faced internal denial. Many elites refused to accept that the climate was changing. Poets and philosophers blamed moral decay, divine punishment, or foreign influence. As a result, policy lagged behind reality. In the USA, climate change is still contested in some political spheres despite overwhelming scientific evidence. This delays action and divides public opinion, weakening long-term strategy. Rome's agricultural system had little flexibility. When traditional regions failed, there were few backups. Over-reliance on monocultures and centralized storage left them vulnerable. In the United States, crop diversity has declined. Industrial farming practices increase yield but reduce ecological resilience. According to USDA reports, a small number of crops now dominate American agriculture, making them highly sensitive to climate disruption. Rome's environmental collapse also weakened military readiness. Armies needed food, horses, and reliable roads. As conditions worsened, provisioning faltered. Morale dropped. Desertion increased. In the USA, climate events have already impacted military installations. Flooding at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, rising seas near Norfolk Naval Station, and heat waves during training exercises all point to a growing vulnerability. Rome's decline shows that climate risk is not isolated, it is systemic. The environment supports every function of a society. When that foundation shifts, the cracks reach every level. The USA has technological advantages Rome never dreamed of: satellites, predictive models, disaster relief. But the challenge is coordination, not capacity. Without unified planning and bipartisan commitment, even the best tools go unused. Rome never developed a national climate strategy because it lacked the concept. The USA does not. That's the difference. And the responsibility. Rome's collapse was not caused by climate alone, but climate amplified every existing weakness: economic inequality, political instability, military overreach, and public distrust. That's the pattern modern historians trace. The USA still has time to strengthen its foundations, diversify its systems, and lead the world in climate resilience. But denial, delay, and division risk repeating history. Here is a question for you. When the climate changes faster than the culture, which one survives? Part 11. The loss of innovation. In its early centuries, Rome was a powerhouse of engineering, logistics, and applied innovation. It did not invent everything it used, but it mastered the art of scaling ideas, arches in architecture, concrete in construction, aqueducts for water delivery, and road networks that transformed trade and warfare. Roman engineers built marvels that endured for millennia. Yet as the empire aged, innovation slowed. According to historians and archaeologists, very few new technologies emerged in the 4th and 5th centuries. In some cases, older systems were forgotten. Technical knowledge became guarded by elite guilds, and experimentation was replaced with tradition. As resources tightened and political risk grew, fewer dared to innovate. In the modern United States, innovation has been the core of its global influence. From the moon landing to Silicon Valley, from the internet to biotechnology, American breakthroughs have changed the world. But recent reports from institutions like the National Science Board warn of a troubling trend. Federal research and development investment, once a major driver of progress, has declined as a share of GDP since the 1960s. Private investment has increased, but it often focuses on near-term profit rather than long-term discovery. Rome faced a similar transition, from public innovation for society to private conservatism for survival. In its later years, many Romans distrusted new systems. Roads weren't repaired. New machines were rarely adopted. Society prioritized defense and ritual over experimentation. In the USA, studies show that bureaucratic hurdles, declining STEM education, and regulatory gridlock slow innovation in key sectors like energy, transportation, and manufacturing. The very success of older systems creates inertia. Rome once led the ancient world in maritime engineering, yet ship design stagnated after the 1st century. Records suggest trade vessels were not significantly improved for centuries. In the USA, many of the country's airports, rail systems, and electric grids rely on mid-20th century design. While digital innovation has exploded, physical infrastructure has lagged. Rome's stagnation also stemmed from economic concentration. As wealth centralized in elite families, fewer resources were available for entrepreneurs and inventors. The patronage that once supported thinkers like Vitruvius or Galen dried up. In America, the startup ecosystem remains dynamic, but access to capital is often concentrated in specific regions and industries. Rural innovation, public sector science, and basic research often struggle for funding. Rome's educational institutions also declined. Public libraries, once funded by wealthy patrons, disappeared. Technical schools lost students. Practical knowledge became siloed in religious institutions or craft guilds. In the United States, universities still lead the world in research, but rising tuition, political battles over curricula, and the erosion of humanities and basic science funding are warning signs. A society that treats education as a private good rather than a public necessity risks long-term decline. In Rome, innovation faded because urgency disappeared. The empire no longer felt it had to compete. It controlled its world, until it didn't. In the USA, global competition is rising. Nations like China, India, and Germany are increasing investment in clean energy, AI, quantum computing, and advanced manufacturing. The USA still leads in many areas, but gaps are growing. Rome's innovators also faced a cultural problem. As the empire grew more hierarchical, Questioning old ideas was discouraged. Deference replaced debate. Manuals copied older designs without testing new ones. In the USA, freedom of thought remained strong, but political polarization and online echo chambers are undermining evidence-based discourse. When ideas are filtered through ideology rather than experimentation, discovery suffers. Rome also failed to link innovation to resilience. Aqueducts were marvels, but when they broke, no new system replaced them. In the USA, resilience is becoming a major concern. From electric grids vulnerable to blackouts, to supply chains disrupted by weather or war, experts warn that innovation must be tied to stability, not just convenience. Rome's scientific knowledge wasn't lost in a day. But over decades, it became irrelevant to a society that no longer valued change. Documents were preserved, but unread. Inventions were remembered, but not used. The USA still produces incredible science and technology, but the challenge is deployment. According to studies from MIT and Brookings, new discoveries in energy, medicine, and transport often take decades to reach broad application. Cost, regulation, and public mistrust are barriers Rome never solved either. Rome's fall was not just military or economic, it was intellectual. When its people stopped believing they could build something better, they started protecting what was left. That mindset, more than any barbarian invasion, marked the beginning of the end. In America, the spirit of innovation remains strong, but it must be renewed, distributed, and protected. Investment must reach beyond profit, education must reward curiosity, and culture must prize invention over repetition. The greatest civilizations fall not when they lose what they have, but when they stop imagining what they could become. Here is a question for you. Are we still inventing the future, or just upgrading the past? Part 12. The Final Disconnect. By the 5th century, the Roman Empire had not yet fallen in one dramatic moment, but it had already fallen in spirit. The institutions that once unified it no longer worked. The Senate held meetings, but few listened. Emperors issued laws, but provinces ignored them. Armies marched under the imperial banner, but loyalty lay with local generals. Coins still bore the eagle, but inflation made them worthless. Roads still led to Rome, but travelers no longer believed they'd find answers there. The Great Collapse was not a single event. It was a gradual severing of ties between a government and its people, between identity and reality. In the modern United States, institutions still stand. Laws are passed. Elections are held. The dollar is strong. Yet beneath the surface, a growing number of Americans feel disconnected. According to Gallup, trust in Congress, media, and even democracy itself is at historic lows. Fewer than 30% of Americans believe their children will have a better future. Civic optimism, once a defining national trait, is giving way to doubt. Rome once promised civitas, a shared identity rooted in law, duty, and belonging. But as inequality rose, infrastructure failed, and loyalty fractured, many stopped seeing the empire as theirs. In the USA, surveys from Pew Research show rising tribalism across geography, race, ideology, and income. National symbols mean different things to different people. A shared narrative is fading. Rome's disconnect was also economic. The elite grew richer as the poor fell into debt. Tax burdens increased on small landholders while aristocrats secured exemptions. Historical edicts revealed desperate attempts to freeze professions, force hereditary labor, and compel tax collection through penalties. In the United States, income inequality has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. The top 10% control nearly 70% of all wealth. Meanwhile, basic costs, housing, healthcare, education, continue to rise faster than wages for most workers. Rome's tax system eventually became so broken that entire cities were abandoned just to escape it. The final disconnect was not just financial. It was emotional. Rome stopped inspiring people to fight for it. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 CE, the shock was profound, but not because of material loss. It was the symbolism. The city that once ruled the world had become vulnerable. In the USA, no invading army has sacked its capital, but moments of crisis, from the 2008 financial collapse to January 6, 2021, have shattered the image of permanence. Americans are now more aware that their system, while strong, is not invincible. In late Rome, people adapted by turning inward. Local rulers offered security. Private militias protected landowners. Religion provided meaning as politics failed. The imperial structure remained, but its power was hollow. In America, the rise of private security, gated communities, and alternative media reflect similar shifts. When national systems are mistrusted, people build their own. But fragmentation, while comforting locally, weakens the whole. Rome also suffered from elite detachment. Senators relocated to the countryside, investing in luxury estates rather than cities. Public service lost status. According to archaeological studies, urban investment declined while rural villas expanded. In the USA, geographic wealth concentration has created metro bubbles. Some cities boom, others collapse. The divide between coastal affluence and inland struggle has become a political fault line. Rome's emperors kept ruling until the very end, issuing coins, making proclamations, appearing in triumphal processions. But their words carried less weight with each passing year. When the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 CE, most citizens barely noticed. Power had already shifted to warlords, bishops, and landlords. In the United States, the office of the presidency still commands global attention. But the legislative and judicial branches often appear paralyzed. Partisan stalemates, delayed confirmations, and executive orders have replaced consensus building. The machinery of government runs, but confidence in outcomes is fading. Rome's collapse came not from a single failure, but from the accumulation of disconnects between capital and province, elite and citizen, tradition and reality. In the USA, the risks are similar. No single crisis will end the republic. But the slow unraveling of shared identity, responsibility, and trust can achieve the same result. Yet the comparison is not destiny. It's a warning. The USA has advantages Rome never had: democracy, technology, a free press, and a history of reinvention. But these tools must be used. Rome had moments when it could have changed course, and didn't. The question is not whether America is Rome. The question is whether it's willing to listen to the lessons. The empire that seemed eternal is now a ruin. Its story is carved in stone. The American story is still being written. Here is a final question for you. Will we learn from the fall, or follow it? Rome did not fall in one day. It declined through ignored warnings. Each crisis made the next inevitable. America is not Rome. But patterns matter. History rewards awareness. It punishes denial. The Roman Empire believed itself eternal. So did every power before it. The question is not whether collapse is coming. The question is whether lessons are learned. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more investigative history, and share your thoughts below.